An explosion of fireworks momentarily painted the lake neon pink before the water returned to its blackened state. Bobby kicked his leg and circulated his arms to keep himself afloat, watching another burst of color. Excitement filled him as the booms pounded in his ears and the sky sizzled. On the dock someone was watching him, and he pretended not to notice since Abigail was so close to him. She meant well, but her skills as a wingman typically left Bobby leaving with no more than an "it was nice to meet you." Abigail took a swig from the bottle in her hand and leaned her head against his shoulder.
Ooh!
She jerked her head off him, pointing at the dock.
A float!
Bobby saw the tube hanging halfway off the dock after a young man lazily tossed it aside. He sighed at the silent task Abigail assigned to him. She was either too drunk or too lazy to retrieve it herself.
Fine, but you're done,
he said, taking her bottle as he floated away.
What? Why?
Because I don't need you drowning.
Lifting himself out of the lake, water drenched the wood beneath his pruned feet. Up close, he recognized the man who had been watching him. It was Asher. Bobby quickly averted his eyes, torn between saying hello and pretending he hadn't noticed him. He hurried to the tube that had been haphazardly discarded and scooped it up. Walking to the other side of the dock so he could re-enter the water closest to Abigail, he passed Asher. "Are you going to ignore me, Bobby?" Asher asked. Bobby turned to him and laughed nervously.
Oh, I didn't think you recognized me.
He lied. Of course he had. He'd been staring since Bobby first noticed him half an hour ago. It hasn't been that long. The fireworks glistened off Asher's ghostly white skin.
5 years, actually.
Bobby reminded him. Asher looked past him and into the water. Your circle hasn't changed that much. Abigail was clumsily swimming her way to them. Bobby shifted the tube. His friend group changed drastically since they were 17, but Abigail was a permanent fixture. Asher didn't need to know that, though. Not to disappear without so much as a word. Not even to his parents. Seeing him after all this time under those circumstances was bizarre to say the least. He looked exactly as he had the day he left. Bobby wondered how long he'd been back, and what mysterious events transpired during his absence. As if Asher read his mind, he said, "I'm sorry about leaving without saying goodbye. I can explain if you give me the chance."
Hey.
Abigail said, crossing her arms and leaning on the dock. She looked from Asher to Bobby. Bobby paused, setting the tube in the water beside Abigail.
Give us a minute?
He asked Asher. Asher nodded, and Abigail hopped in the tube as Bobby returned to the water. As he pulled the tube away from the dock, she said,
Was that fucking Asher Evans? I thought he was dead.
Bobby peered back at Asher. He sat alone, staring after him. Looking around, no one else paid him any attention, as if he hadn't come back from the dead.
Evidently not,
Bobby said, pulling them further into the lake. He and Asher had a fling in high school, cut short by his disappearance. Bobby stopped.
Would you mind if I...
Abigail sighed.
Go. But be back before 1. I don't have to call an Uber out here.
She grabbed his arm, nearly tipping out of the tube.
And tell me everything.
Yes, ma'am.
Bobby and Asher had a couple drinks before retreating to a parked car on the side of the road. Bobby planned to ask where Asher had been all these years and why he left so suddenly. Did he know everyone, including his parents, thought he was dead? But the alcohol had more control over his hormones than his desires for answers. Buzzed, he didn't really care about the 5-year mystery. They kissed, and Bobby's attention switched to the inside of the car at the sight of a man in the front seat.
Who's that?
Bobby asked, shocked.
Ow!
He said with a laugh after Asher bit his neck. My DD, Asher said. Bobby almost asked why the man waited in the car, but he was interrupted. Would you like to get out of here? Asher asked. Sanity appeared as Bobby's mind tugged at the questions he'd forgotten in passion.
So, are you going to tell me where you've been?
If that's really what you want to spend our time doing, Asher smiled. Bobby's neck throbbed, but he ignored it. Asher opened the car door, grabbed their drinks off the hood, and they both slid inside. The driver turned on the engine and drove off before Bobby had time to ask where they were going. They sipped their drinks in between messy kisses. Firework lights sneaked in through the windows, casting colorful shadows on Asher's pale skin. He kept returning to Bobby's neck. Bobby broke away from his lips, feeling lightheaded. His neck pounded with new intensity. He put 2 fingers to it, and when he pulled them away, they came back smeared in blood.
You...
He struggled for words. Asher came in and out of focus, and Bobby swore his once white skin turned a sickly purplish gray. He didn't remember drinking that much, and laughed anxiously as his head bobbed. Then he screamed as a shocking eruption of searing pain came from his neck.
What the fuck?
He slurred quietly through a wince. Bobby forced his head up, and he caught Asher's devilish grin before his head involuntarily reeled against the window. Another cry filled the car. It happened so quickly that Bobby didn't even recognize it as his own. His head clasped his neck as he writhed in agony against the door. Pathetic moans escaped through panic breaths. Asher's face came into focus in colorful flashes, and in unison with the explosion of the sky. His face appeared in a slightly different placement with each boom. Beside Bobby, in front of Bobby, slightly off-center in Bobby's sight, inches from his face. Before he could make sense of what was happening, the car door opened, and someone caught him as he fell out of it, gently placing him on the concrete. His neck no longer burned, and the panic that was there moments ago quickly faded into a calm terror and uncertainty. He didn't remember the car stopping or anyone getting out of it. There were no more fireworks. The night was quiet, as if hours had passed instead of seconds. Looking around, a sandbox and a jungle gym sat in the center of a field, and a line of trees were to his left. He was at Everwood Park. The car screeched away, leaving behind the smell of burnt rubber. Bobby looked up from the ground, wondering how much time really passed, and his eyes widened as his throat tightened in his stunned state. It took him a moment to recognize the figure because his complexion was the gray-purple he thought he imagined the car, and his face was bloated and sickly. But there was no denying that it was Asher, smiling with two sharp canines gleaming in the lamplight from above. Bobby pushed himself from the ground, sprinting before he found his footing, and tumbled back down after only a couple steps, scraping his knee like he did at his exact park many times as a child. He chanced to glance behind him. Asher hadn't come any closer, and had somehow already retreated outside the lamplight's glowing ring. The dark outline of his body stood in the middle of the field. Bobby searched for the best escape. The place was empty, and there wasn't another building for at least a mile, aside from the restrooms past the basketball court. Hot air caressed his neck, and he froze before he found the courage to turn around. When he did, Asher's grotesque face was inches from his own. Bobby broke into a run and headed straight for the bathrooms, passing the vending machines before he found sanctuary within the grimy concrete walls. The lock didn't offer much security, and he fumbled with the metal hook before placing it inside the rusted hole. He listened for a tense moment before reaching into the pocket of his swimming trunks and pulling out his phone. Dialing 911, he watched the door as the dispatcher picked up, asking for his emergency.
Yes, I'm trapped in the bathroom at Everwood Park. I need help.
Sir, what is your situation? Are you safe?
A singular, threatening pound came from the door.
Sir?
The dispatcher asked.
No.
Bobby replied, backing further from the door until his bare skin hit the sink, causing him to hysterically whirl around. When his eyes met the mirror, he dropped his phone just as the dispatcher began to speak again. Inching closer to the mirror, his horror grew. Pus oozed from red, swollen wounds that covered his face. As he touched one of the wounds, it split open, producing a trickle of blood down his face. He screamed and turned on the faucet. The water ran brown from rusty pipes. He splashed his face with the water and then went for the soap dispenser. Pushing down on the distributor, the light, foamy soap that always appeared was replaced with something vile. His hand covered in thick yellow and red liquid that smelled like death. Pus and blood. Bobby vomited in the sink. Another pound on the door sent him jumping again, hanging onto that same sink for stability. A weak cry came from his mouth before he quieted at a hissing coming from the stall. It grew louder, and a cottonmouth slithered under the sink. He leapt backward, and the snake hissed, posing for a strike. He backed against the wall, and water shot from the toilet into the stall. Bobby covered his head as toilet water rained out from behind the stall walls. The water broke through the sticky sweat that clung to his skin. Looking under the sink, the snake was gone, and the water stopped spewing. He searched for the reptile, but there was no evidence of it. The concrete floor was dry, as though water hadn't flooded at all. The water still ran its rusted stream in the sink, and Bobby returned to it. He tried the soap dispenser again, but this time he pushed with one finger, letting the fluffy white soap fall to the floor. When he looked in the mirror, his face was clear of wounds. Then the squeak of the stall door slowly groaned, and an enlarged, discolored hand latched on the edge of the wall from the other side. As quickly as he could, Bobby lurched for the door. When he opened it, he made sure to slam it shut behind him, jogging backward with his eyes glued to it. His legs just about gave out from under him as he found himself in front of the vending machines, too weak to go any further. For a moment, all was quiet. He scanned the park as far as picnic tables on the other side of the field, but saw no one. He was helpless and alone. Unseen bugs chirped, and he felt a cold hand on his shoulder. Despite his ailment, he tried to run, but was spun around with a strength far greater than his own. There stood Asher, with his bloated, sickly face and unnatural animalistic teeth. Bobby knew he should try escaping again, but he couldn't bring himself to do anything but stare at the face of the boy he once knew. In an instant, Bobby's eyes bulged from severe pain. Asher pulled him closer as his parasitic fangs sank deeper into Bobby's neck. He began to feel weak and faint, and the world past Asher blurred until there was nothing left. When Asher was finished, he vanished as though he were never there, leaving Bobby's bloodless body in the vending machine's glow.